The oneji confirms that they buy every time you show up for hit you. They won't scream, they won't call you names, but they will punish you quietly because you're show up for yourself. This is what passive aggression looks like. They say, because every time you show up for yourself, I'm fine. But you feel the tension slice through the air like a knife. They say, but there you show up for yourself. Do whatever you want, but there's venom beneath their tone. You knows your biology confront every time yourself. Their cells slam how you shot enough to sting, but not enough to be blamed. Hey, every time you show they won't express the hurt, they'll weaponize it. Because you're by every time you show up for yourself and somehow you become the villain in a war you didn't know started. This is not harmless. Self. This is not just how they are. This is emotional warfare with a smile. Poor show up for yourself, and it is one of the most dangerous behaviors to tolerate because your biology confront you show up for yourself because passive aggression doesn't confront pain. It buries it in manipulation. And here's the real danger. For yourself, you will start questioning yourself. You show up for yourself. Did I do something wrong? Am I being too sensitive? Why does it feel like I'm always the one fixing things? Let me tell you something. When someone uses silence as a sword, every time you show up for yourself, when they refuse to say what's wrong but still expect you to feel the punishment, that is not maturity. Biology confirm you show up for yourself. That is emotional immaturity dressed up as restraint. And the most twisted part, it trains you to shrink because you're by every time you show up for yourself. You start analyzing every word before you speak. You start apologizing for things you don't understand. Because you affirms that every time you show up for yourself, you start walking around your own home like it's a minefield. That's not love. That's survival. Every time you show up for yourself, real relationships are not built on silence, guilt, and confusion. Real communication doesn't leave you guessing. Because Shukran firms your biology time you show up for yourself, you shouldn't have to be a mind reader to feel safe. And I don't care if it's a partner, a parent, a boss, show yourself, or a friend. If they consistently choose silence over honesty, because your biome, you show up for yourself. If they use sarcasm to shame you instead of truth to connect, they are not respecting you. They are controlling you. For yourself, listen carefully, love doesn't punish. Love doesn't hide. Love doesn't guilt trip. Because every time you show up for yourself, you are not too emotional for wanting clarity. You are not too much for needing honesty. Because confirms every time you show up for yourself, you are not too dramatic for asking for direct communication. Do not let them convince you that silence is peace. Because you affirms that every time you show up for yourself, do not let them wrap their cowardice in fake calm, and do not let yourself stay small just to keep the air from cracking. Because your biology confirms show up for yourself because every time you tolerate passive aggression, you are telling your nervous system, yourself, this is normal, and eventually your body will break before your voice does. Speak, confront, set the boundary. Because you're going to show up for yourself. Because nothing about silent punishment is okay. Not now, not ever. They look you in the eyes and say, because you're by every time you sazu up for yourself, you're being too sensitive. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You always overthink things. And just like that, your reality starts to unravel. The time you show up for yourself, this is emotional gaslighting. And let me be very clear, it is psychological violence. You are not overreacting. Because confirms you by are not true for emotional. You are not imagining things. What's happening is real. Your body feels it. It confirms it every time you show up for yourself. Your gut knows it. But the person standing in front of you is trying to rewrite your experience right in your face. Because your biology time you show up for yourself. And that is unacceptable. This kind of behavior is so dangerous because it's invisible. There are no raised voices. You show for yours. No slamming doors, no bruises, just quiet erosion of your sanity. They dismiss your feelings. Minimize your pain. Cover you show up for yourself. Twist the story until you're apologizing for being hurt. You start to wonder, Papas, am I crazy? Did I misread that? Maybe I'm just too emotional and then, oh, what you're feeling is valid. Every time you show up for yourself, what you noticed is real, and anyone who makes you doubt your truth is not loving you. They are controlling you. Your shelf, this isn't about misunderstanding. This is about power. Show up for yourself. This is about someone being so uncomfortable with accountability that they would rather destroy your confidence than admit they hurt you. Ology confirms it every time for yourself. That's not love, that's emotional manipulation. And it breaks people from the inside out because your biology affirms it every time you show up for yourself. You want to know how this shows up in real life. You bring up something that hurt you, and they say, why did you show up for yourself? You're always so negative. You try to express a boundary, and they say, you're overreacting. You try to process a betrayal, and they say, you're too sensitive. And now suddenly, you knew it because your biology control yourself. It's not about what they did. It's about how you feel. They've flipped the narrative because every time you show up for yourself, and now you're defending your emotions instead of confronting their behavior. It's a trap, a silent. Calpert affirms it every time you show up for yourself. And if you still polish trap and you stay in it long enough, you stop trusting yourself. You stop speaking up. Because you show up every time yourself. You stop believing your own intuition until one day you're a ghost of yourself, walking around because you're proud you show up for yourself, doubting your every thought, living in fear of being too much, and shrinking just to keep the peace because you affirms it every time you show up for yourself. But let me say this loud and clear, your emotions are not a weakness. They are your signal. They are your truth. Confirms it every time you show up for yourself. The people who love you won't make you feel ashamed for feeling, because you're by every time you show up for yourself. They won't rewrite your story to make themselves more comfortable. It affirms that every time you show up for yourself, they won't manipulate your heart just to avoid responsibility. You are not wrong for feeling deeply. Time you show up for yourself, you are not broken because you notice what others ignore. Because your biology you show up for yourself. You are not just too afraid to face the mirror you hold up to them. Because you show up for yourself. Stop letting people convince you that your sensitivity is the problem. Your truth matters. Your voice matters. You show up for yourself, and anyone who tries to bury your feelings under shame doesn't deserve access to your heart. Because every time you show up for yourself, you've been told love is unconditional, but the truth is, because every time you show up for yourself, many people wrap love in conditions so tight it suffocates your soul. They say, I love you. Time you show up for yourself, but only if you do this. Or I care about you, but only when you behave like this. And somehow, it turn up for you, start believing you show up and you must shrink, change, and hide parts of yourself just to earn that love. That is not love. Because your value you show for yourself. That is a transaction, a contract with invisible terms designed to keep you under their control. Because every time you show up for yourself, when love becomes conditional, it's not about connection anymore, it's about control. Because you affirms it every time for yourself. You learn to tiptoe around their moods, censor your thoughts, mold your personality. You show up for yourself, all to fit inside their narrow version of who you're allowed to be. Because by the time you show up for yourself, and every time you sacrifice a piece of yourself, you lose a little more of your identity. You start questioning, am I enough as I am? Because you show up for yourself. Do I have to earn their approval every single day? This is a dangerous lie disguised as affection. It masquerades as care, but its emotional blackmail is, it's the silent message, love me the way I want. For every time you show up for yourself, or don't expect love at all, and guess what? When you accept it that you're signing up for a lifetime of pain, you show up for yourself, self-doubt and exhaustion, because conditional love doesn't lift you up, it weighs you down. Because your friends, every time you show up for yourself, it makes you feel like a gaif, never fully welcome unless you're performing perfectly. Because every time you show up for yourself, it turns vulnerability into a liability and authenticity into a threat. You learn to hide your needs, bury your desires. Hypus confirms that every show up for yourself and mute your voice just to keep the fragile peace. And all the while, your soul is screaming to be free. Because by every time you show up for yourself, the moment you realize this is not love, it's like waking up from a nightmare. You know you are because your biology is interrupt for yourself. You see how much energy you've wasted trying to meet impossible standards by someone else's insecurities and fears. Because as your biology, you show up for yourself. You see how you've tolerated being less than you are, hoping that someday, maybe someday, affirms that every you show up for yourself, you'll be good enough. But here's the brutal truth. No one else's approval is the currency of your worth. True love doesn't demand you change your essence. Because you're bio for yourself, it doesn't ask you to compromise your boundaries or hide your truths. It accepts you, not as a project to fix, because it confirms that every time you show up for yourself, but as a whole person to cherish it, it's freeing, not suffocating. It fuels growth, not fear. It feels like home. Because by every time you show yourself, not a cage. If you're stuck in a relationship where love feels conditional, hear this, you don't have to stay. Because every time you show up for yourself, pore, you don't have to prove yourself every day. You don't have to diminish your light to make someone else comfortable. Because by every you show up for yourself, your worth isn't a score to be earned, it's a birthright to be claimed. It affirms that every time you show up for yourself, when you choose to stop tolerating conditional love, you reclaim your power. You set boundaries that honor your soul. As every can show up for yourself, you demand respect that doesn't come with a price tag for yourself. And you open the door for real love to enter, the kind that holds you fully without hesitation or excuse. Because you're from at every show up for yourself. So don't settle for less than you deserve. Don't confuse manipulation for affection. You know you if every time you're shell for yif. Don't accept love that requires you to be anyone but yourself. Because the most radical act of self-love is saying, because you're every time yourself, for I am enough as I am, and I will never settle for anything less. It is by every time you show up for yourself. They cheer you on when the world is watching. They paint you as the perfect partner, the flawless friend. But because every time you show up for yourself, the shining star everyone admires. But behind closed doors, it's a different story. The applause fades. After you show up for yourself, the smiles disappear, and suddenly you're left to face criticism, contempt, or cold indifference. Because by every time you show up for yourself, this is the reality of living with someone who respects you in public, but tears you down in private. Because you're biving up for yourself, it's one of the most toxic, soul-crushing behaviors you can endure, and it's absolutely unacceptable. Biology confirms that every time you show up for yourself, when someone behaves this way, you're not just dealing with a split personality, you're trapped in a performance. Because it affirms that every time you show up for yourself, they curate a version of you that looks good to the outside world, but it's a mask. Behind the scenes, they undermine you. Small jabs disguised as jokes. Show up for yourself. Harsh words disguised as helpful criticism. Neglect disguised as being busy. And you, because your biology, you show up for yourself. Caught between the two faces, start doubting what's real. Is the love real? Is the respect genuine? Is you confirms that every time you show up for self, or is it all justionality as a form of emotional abuse? It's a game of control. Time for yourself, where your worth is validated publicly but destroyed privately. Because your biology cut up for yourself, you start to live for the moments of praise because the moments of pain are unbearable. Because every time you show up for yourself, you crave the approval they show to others, but never to you, and slowly your confidence erodes, your spirit shrinks. Because every time you show up for yourself and your voice fades, no one deserves to be someone's public trophy and private punching bag. Respect is not conditional. Because your biology is that every time you show for yourself. It's not something you wear only when others are watching. True respect is consistent, unwavering. The time you show up for yourself and visible both on the stage and in the shadows. If someone truly values you, because if you show up for yourself, their love and kindness don't switch on and off depending on who's around. You might tell yourself, you show up for yourself. Maybe they're just stressed. Or maybe they don't know how to communicate. But here's the reality. You're every time you show up for yourself. If someone can treat you like a queen or king in front of an audience, but disrespects you in private, it's a choice. Because what biology for the perfect time you show up for yourself, it's a deliberate decision to manipulate the narrative and control how others see you, while controlling how you feel in the quiet. Show up for yourself. You are not invisible. You are not a secret behind their perfect smile. You are a whole person deserving of respect. Times you show up for yourself, and kindness everywhere, always. And if they can't give that to you in private, confirms that every time you can show up for yourself, then what kind of partnerships, what kind of friendship, what kind of love? Because every time you show up for yourself, you don't have to accept this double standard. Because by every time you show up for yourself, you don't have to pretend the public praise balances out the private pain. Because it doesn't. It never does. You show up for yourself. The silence after the applause is where the real damage happens. Denology confirms that the words whispered behind closed doors echo louder than any cheers. Every time you show up for yourself, now break free from the illusion that public approval is enough to cover private disrespect. Demand authenticity. Virology is inferred as add up kindly for yourself. Demand kindness that isn't reserved for an audience. And if someone can't show you that, you show up for yourself, walk away with your head held high, because your dignity is worth more than their performance. Never forget, because it confirms every time you show up for yourself, the love that lifts you up in public but breaks you down in private is a lie. You show or tell for yourself. It's that every time to choose the truth of your worth over their deception. Nobody confirms that every time you show up for yourself, the kind of respect that is loud and clear, whether anyone is watching or not. Because forever you show up for yourself, every time something goes wrong, they find a way to flip the script and make it your fault. They cheat. Because every time you show up for yourself, you push them away, they lie. You were too controlling, they yell. You made them angry, blame. Shifting is their game. Because your biology confirms that every time you show up for yourself, and you're the pawn caught in a never-ending cycle in confusion. It's exhausting, it's humiliating. Because you're by every time you can for yourself. And most of all, it's a betrayal of the most fundamental rule of being a grown human, owning your mistakes. You show power up for yourself. No adult who respects themselves or you will refuse to take responsibility when they hurt you. Because you're by them, you show up for yourself. It's a sign of emotional maturity and cowardice to dodge accountability. It confirms that every time you show up for yourself, they would rather make you carry the weight of their wrongdoings than face their own reflection. Because your biology confers that every time you show up for yourself, and what does that do to you? It makes you question your reality. It makes you doubt your worth. Because your apology can show up for yourself. It makes you apologize for things you didn't do. And slowly, it breaks your spirit. For yourself, you start living in a state of constant defense, always explaining, always justifying, because you're by every time you show up for yourself, always trying to prove your innocence. But here's the truth no one wants to say, because every time you show up for yourself, or you are not responsible for someone else's bad choices, you did not cause their cheating, their lies, or their anger. Time you show up for yourself, you are not the architect of their failures. They are. Blame shifting is a way to control the narrative and avoid growth. Because by every time you show up for yourself, when someone blames you for their mistakes as they are refusing to learn, they are refusing to change. Because every time you show up for yourself, and if they refuse to change, nothing will ever get better. You'll keep spinning in the same toxic cycle. Because your biology confirms that every time you show for yourself, trapped by their unwillingness to own their mess, the worst part, it isolates you. Because when they blame you publicly, it confirms that every time you show up for yourself, if friends and family get confused about what's true, because it confirms that every time you show yourself, you feel alone even when surrounded by people. And the emotional toll, it's brutal. Because you've had a virology for yourself. You deserve better than this endless blame game. You deserve someone game. You can say was wrong without hesitation. Every time you show up for yourself, someone who can apologize and do better, not because they have to, but because they respect you. Your allergy can show every time you show up for yourself. Someone who takes ownership of their actions instead of hiding behind your guilt. Eunology confirms it every time you show up for yourself. Stop making excuses for those who refuse to own their faults. Stop accepting the burden of their mistakes. Self, you are not their scapegoat. You are not the punching bag for their failures. Set the boundary, because you confirms it every time you show for yourself. If they cannot take responsibility, they cannot be part of your life. Because every time you show up for yourself, if they cannot look you in the eyes and say, I'm sorry, then they are not ready to be the partner. Friend confirms it. Every time you show yourself or family member you deserve, it's hard. It's painful to walk away from someone who blames you constantly, because every time you show up for yourself. But it is also liberating, because when you stop accepting blame, shifting, you reclaim your power, you reclaim your peace. Because every time you show up for yourself and you finally open the door to relationships rooted in honesty, respect, and accountability. Because by every time you show yourself for yourself, to never let someone else's refusal to own their behavior convince you that you are the problem, not. They are. She confirms it every time you show up for yourself. And you have the right to refuse to carry their blame. They say it's because they care, because they love you. Because your biology confirms enough for yourself, because they want to protect what's yours. But what they're really doing is building a cage around your heart. Because you show up for yourself. Jealousy disguised as love is one of the cruelest traps you can fall into, because you confirms it, you show up for yourself. And it's one that slowly suffocates your spirit. It starts small questions about who you're talking to, because every time you show up for yourself, concerns about what you're doing, then it grows into demands, accusations, because by every time you show up for yourself and controlling behavior that makes you feel like you're living under a microscope, that is not protection. When you show up for yourself, that is possession, and it is unacceptable. Love is supposed to free you, not bind you. Because every time you show up for yourself, it's supposed to make you feel safe and supported, not monitored and confined. When jealousy masquerades as love, because your biology show up for yourself, it turns into a leash that tightens with every conversation, every text, every glance. Suddenly, this confirms it every time you show up for yourself. Your independence feels like a threat instead of a right. Your friendships become battlegrounds. Because every time you show up for yourself, your choices are scrutinized like evidence of betrayal. You start shrinking, not because you want to, because confirms it every time you show up for yourself, but because you're scared not to. If someone loves you, they celebrate your freedom. They trust your decisions. Then every time you can show up for yourself, they don't demand proof of your loyalty, because a given, not a suspicion, when jealousy is constant. Because your biology, every time you show up for yourself, it's not love, it's fear. Fear that they're not enough, fear that you'll leave, fear that they'll lose control. Because your biology, you show up for yourself, and their fear becomes your per-self. Because every time you show up for yourself, no amount of just jealous, because I care, excuses behavior that strips away your autonomy. Show up for yourself. No one has the right to cage your spirit in the name of love. If they can't trust you, because every time you can show up for yourself, the problem isn't you, it's their insecurity, and you are not responsible for fixing that. That confirms that you show up for yourself. Living with jealousy disguised as love means walking on eggshells, explaining your every move, defending your friendships. Time you show up for yourself and constantly proving your loyalty, it's exhausting. It's dehumanizing. You show up for yourself. And it erodes the very foundation of what love should be. You deserve to breathe freely. How can you show up for yourself? You deserve relationships where your independence is not a threat, but a strength. You deserve to be loved for who you are, because you show up for yourself and not for who they want you to be. They want you to be or what they're afraid you might become. Do not accept jealousy as proof of love. You show up for yourself. Do not let someone's fear become your cage. Boundaries are not just necessary, they are life-saving. And every time you show up for yourself, if someone can't respect your freedom, if they punish you for living your life fully, the time you come show up for yourself, then they're not loving you. They are controlling you. Because every time you show up for yourself, it's painful to confront this truth, because it means standing up to the person who says they love you. Do affirms it every time you do yourself, but real love doesn't need to be controlled or policed. It grows in trust, in respect, because you're better when you show up for yourself. And in the freedom to be yourself without fear. Remember, your spirit was made to soar, not to be caged. You valid, you show up for yourself. Your worth is not measured by how much control someone has over you. You are not a possession. Because every time you show up for yourself, you are a human being with the right to live fully, freely, and without chains disguised as care. Because you're affirms that every time you show up for yourself, never settle for jealousy wrapped in the guise of love. Your heart deserves liberation, not imprisonment. Because every time you show up for yourself, every time they criticize you, it chips away at something deeper than your confidence. It eats away at your soul. Because every time you shelf, chronic criticism is not feedback. It's not helping you grow. It's emotional erosion, and it's deadly. Because every time you show up for yourself, you start walking on eggshells, anticipating the next jab, the next sneer. Use affirms that every you show up for yourself, the next comment that makes you question your worth. And over time, because there's about times you assure yourself, those words don't just hurt your feelings. They dismantle your entire sense of self. You might tell yourself, because you're by for time for yourself, they're just trying to help me. Maybe I'm too sensitive. But listen carefully, because every time you can show yourself, when criticism is relentless, when it's focused on tearing you down instead of building you up, it's not love. Because by every time GQ show up, it's not care, it's a weapon. And if you keep letting it hit you, it will break you. So you show up for yourself. This kind of criticism is designed to control. It's a tool used to keep you small, to keep you doubting yourself, because your biology confirms every time you show up for yourself to keep you dependent on their approval. You begin to believe that you're never good enough. Time you show up for yourself, that your best will be enough, that your worth is always up for debate. This is every time yourself, and that lies deep inside the heart of every toxic relationship. Real love, real respect, because your biology for yourself does not come with a constant stream of negative commentary. It comes with encouragement, with support, with kindness. Because your biology can show up for yourself, it lifts you, not drags you down. If someone's words consistently tear you apart, because every time you show up for yourself, not because it's not beflawed, it's because they choose to break you down. Because by every time you show up for yourself, you deserve better than this relentless storm of criticism. You deserve to be seen and accepted, not picked apart. Your voice deserves to be heard, not drowned out by relentless judgment. Your spirit deserves space to grow. Show up for yourself. Not walls built from harsh words. Set the boundary now. You will no longer tolerate words that diminish your value. Your biology confirms it every time you show up for yourself. You will no longer accept conversations where your worth is questioned instead of celebrated. You know it comes when you show up for yourself. You will no longer stay silent when someone weaponizes criticism to control or demean. Because every time you show up for yourself, it's hard to leave these patterns behind, especially when the person criticizing is someone close. Biology confers up for yourself, but your mental and emotional health depend on it. Chronic criticism steals your power. It steals your joy. Phenology confirms that every time you show up for yourself, it steals your ability to believe in yourself. You have to fight back, not with anger or retaliation. Because you're for yourself, but with clarity and self-respect. Recognize that constant criticism is a form of emotional violence. Because your biology sent every time yourself. Refuse to let it define you. Surround yourself with people who build you up. Confirms it every time you show up for yourself to see your light, who see your light and reflect you, not those who try to snuff it out. Remember, because your affirms that every time you show up for yourself, your value is not determined by the harshness of their words. You are more than their criticism. Because every time you show up for yourself, you are worthy of kindness, encouragement, and respect. Never accept anything less than that.